Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Some of the more rewarding videos that I've personally made have been ones designed to help beginners entering Dungeons & Dragons for the first time or for people with not a lot of experience. I've got a lot of great positive feedback from some people who were brand new to the hobby, saying that the videos that I made were actually helpful to them, and that always just means a lot to me. And I was looking back at some of the ones that I've done, and most of my advice for beginners videos have really focused on Dungeon Masters, because that's what I know best. That's what I've done for pretty much the last 19 years, I think, at this point. So, that said, there's more room that I think I could dedicate to advice for beginning players, and particularly your first character. I had made a video a while back, just making a character on camera, but I don't think that really goes into enough information. So what I actually want to do is go through the 5th edition Player's Handbook and create a first level character for each and every single class in this book. In addition, I also want to use each of the races as well. There's 12 classes and 9 races, if I'm recalling correctly. So I'll be able to use each and every single one of the races as well as the character classes. Now, this is not going to be a guide on how to make the most powerful or characters or anything like that. That's not really my style. But what it will be is just some things to keep in mind when you're looking at each and every single one of the classes, and it's just some ideas that you can have. And this will be a character build that's meant to be an effective character that you'd be able to take to like D&D Adventures League and use right away. Speaking of which, with that in mind, I will be making the characters using Adventures League guidelines. So it's going to be the standard array for the ability scores. It's going to be the equipment specified in the character class description. And even though they're first level characters, if I were to make one of a higher level, it would use the fixed hit points. So just a few things to keep in mind. So the first video that we're going to do in this series is we're going to be looking at the 5th edition Barbarian. Now, one of the first things that I wanted to kind of talk about for each of these classes is why you may want to play them. What their play style typically is. Now, you can always change things around and do things differently with each of the classes, and that's one of the great things about Dungeons & Dragons, but that's something for when you're a bit more comfortable with the roles. So today I'm going to be, like I said, looking at the Barbarian, and the Barbarian is a great frontline fighter. That's one of the things that they really excel at. They're sort of specialize in melee combat. Now you can do range attacks, and you can do all kinds of things with them, but I just think that they work best when you're running into combat. You have the highest hit dice in the game, so most other fighter types roll a 10-sided dice, so they're getting between 1 and 10 hit points. The Barbarian's rolling 12-sided hit dice, meaning that even on average, they're getting more hit points per level. Barbarians are sort of uncultured, uncivilized. They have sort of their own, moral codes that they follow. They're more in tune with nature, but they can also fly into a rage. And raging in 5th edition is pretty cool, because when you fly into a rage, see, in the past you would get like an increase to your constitution and your strength, which is fine, but I think they do it better in this game, so it doesn't affect your stats at all. What it does is when you fly into a rage, you actually become more resistant to physical damage. So when people are attacking you with weapons or, anything that deals bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing damage, you're only going to be taking half of that. And as someone who's been running a D&D game with a Barbarian in there, especially a low-level Barbarian, I could tell you that taking that half damage really makes a big difference. And when they rage, they also deal extra damage back, which is pretty cool. So if you're the kind of person who just wants to get into, the thick of the fight and just, bash things with weapons, then this is one of the classes for you. And we'll go over their special abilities and their class features, and we'll go over all of that in terms of making a first level character as we go through. But that's just the biggest thing. If your style is you just kind of want to get into melee and hit things, then there you go. Now, you also should know that you don't necessarily want to be initiating fights all the time, because that's going to get very frustrating for the rest of the players. So the idea of getting into melee and hitting things works best when you are in a fight, not because you just caused one. So just one of those things to keep in mind. But without further ado, we're going to go through and we are going to make ourselves a Barbarian. Alright, so one of the first things, if you decide to make a barbarian, or if the barbarian style sounds like it's something that's going to appeal to you, you kind of want to come up with your class, or your race to go along with that class. Now there's a lot of different ways to gain inspiration for this. You can kind of model it after some of your favorite TV show characters or movie characters. I mean, like Conan the Barbarian, for example, is a pretty obvious example. But I also kind of think about the character of Thor in at least the first movie, and he really came across as a barbarian. He loved to fight. He had very little social graces, like, you know, the scene where he smashes the mug in the diner was absolutely great. So I kind of always looked at him as more of a barbarian type than like a straight fighter. You know, he seems very, you know, not refined in his fighting skill. It's just swinging his massive hammer around and bashing things. So that's a character that you can kind of go with as well. One of the great channels that I like to follow on YouTube, GD Art, they're kind of moving more towards LARPing stuff, which is totally cool, but she did do some cool videos about character creation early on. And one of my favorite things that she had mentioned in the character creation was to simply go on Google and just do image searches. You know, you could just type in barbarian and see what kind of art you see, like what kind of images you see, and get inspired by one of those characters. Now for me, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to tie it to one of my miniatures, because I've got a ton of miniatures, and you know, a lot of them are based off of the D&D classes. So I thought, why not kind of pull out some of my favorite barbarian miniatures and just kind of go from there and use that as the basis for creating my character. So I've got three different barbarians here. The first one is the Frenzied Berserker. This was a prestige class in 3rd edition, but you know, there is the Berserker archetype that you can take at 3rd level. So this one I thought was really cool looking. I always loved the art for the Frenzied Berserker, and I thought that this miniature was really cool. Up next I've got the miniature for Wolfgar. So this is a character from the R.A. Salvatore series of novels, and he's got his hammer there, Aegis Fang, which is a throwing and returning magic hammer, which is pretty cool. And then I have Krusk. So Krusk is the iconic D&D barbarian from the 3rd edition Player's Handbook. So each of the classes sort of had an iconic character. I'm going to be honest, this is the one that I'm going to draw the inspiration from in terms of making this particular character, because for me, I've always loved playing half-orc barbarians. Whenever I've played a barbarian back in 3rd edition, it was a half-orc, and as much as the ranger class is my favorite, the very first class I ever played in 3rd edition D&D was a half-orc barbarian. So that's what we're going to go through, and that's what we're going to make here today. So I'm just going to kind of have him at the top of my clipboard here. So we have our basic character sheet. This is just the first of usually like 2 or 3 pages, depending on what kind of class that you're making. This is the only sheet that I'm going to be filling out personally. So this is just your basic standard run-of-the-mill sheet. I'm going to set this aside for now. Well, actually, why don't I fill in some of the details. So I'm actually going to go ahead and actually name this barbarian Krusk as well, since that's the name of the miniature. Alright, and I do apologize, my handwriting's not the best. It's one of those things that I think goes along with being a lefty. But he's going to be a barbarian. And he's going to be a half-orc. Alright, so we've got that information settled. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to set this aside, and I want to just go into the Player's Handbook and go through the character creation steps. So the first thing that I want to do is get my ability scores. So we've got the standard array here. See if I can find it. So the standard array is 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8. So I'm just going to write those numbers down here. So 15, 14, was it 13, 12, 10, and 8? 13, 12, 10, and 8. Alright. So we've got that information. I also know that I'm going to be a half-orc. So half-orcs affect the ability scores that we have. I'm not going to do that yet because the first thing I need to do is assign where my ability scores are going to go. So as a barbarian, in general, you want your physical stats to be amongst the highest. Strength, for the obvious reason of attacking, with your melee weapon, your attack rolls, and your damage rolls are going to be affected by your strength score. You also want to have a decent constitution to get even more hit points, and a good dexterity. Now, the reason that you also want dexterity and constitution to be good is the barbarian class has a special ability called unarmored defense. And what that means is if they're not wearing any armor, in addition to the dexterity modifier, which everyone gets to add if they're unarmored, or depending on the type of armor that they use, you also can add your constitution modifier. So that's kind of a big thing. So you can, so that's why you want to have a good dexterity and a good constitution. Now, one thing I want to do, actually, I'm just going to zoom back out here. I do want to actually look at the half-orc and see what stats they get. I believe it's +2 to strength and +1 to constitution, if I recall correctly. So looking under the half-orc, on page 41, it gives their information. So yeah, they get +2 to strength and they get +1 to their constitution. So with that in mind, looking at our numbers here, what I actually want to do is I'm not going to put my 15 into strength. I'm going to actually put strength as the 14. And the reason for that is I get +2 to it, which is going to increase that 14, where I'm a half-orc, to a 16. Now, if I were to put the strength as the 15 and turn that into a 17, it's the same modifier at this point in time. And the only way for me to get, if I did that, I'd only be able to have one stat of a 16 or 17. But with this one, I'm going to put the 15 as con. So that's my constitution, which is going to affect my hit points, as well as my armor class for the unarmored defense. So that's also going to turn into a 16. At this point, you can choose between either the 13 or the 12 for your dexterity, or at least that's how I'm going to be doing it, where my main focus is going to be on my physical stats. So what I'm actually going to do is put the 13, I'm going to do the 13 as dexterity. And that's going to remain unaltered. Now, as far as intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, I'm actually going to put my charisma as the 8. Now, barbarians get things like intimidate and stuff along those lines that uses the charisma, so this is actually going to have a modifier of -1. But I can offset that with my proficiency bonus, which is probably what I'm going to end up doing. Because, like I said, the 8, the only thing I'm really going to use charisma for as a barbarian is intimidate. So for me, it's just not really necessarily justified enough to have it be, the 12 or even the 10 at this point. The 12 is going to be my wisdom. And the reason for that is I want to have a decent perception, which is something that gets used a lot in Dungeons and Dragons these days. It used to be spot and listen back in 3rd edition, but perception has always played a big role in D&D from the time that it was sort of introduced. So it's your ability to avoid being surprised, it's your ability to, spot certain things when you're exploring dungeons or the wilderness or anything. So it's something that I want to have a decent score in. I also use it for survival, so if I want to do things like tracking, for example, then you can kind of do that. And you know what? I'm actually kind of changing my mind here for charisma, because I was just looking at some of the other skills that I might want to consider actually using. Things like persuasion and stuff along those lines. So I think I'm actually going to put the charisma as the 10, which means it's just going to have no modifier or negative, and I'm going to put the intelligence as 8. So I don't have the conventional intelligence of, like civilized folk. I do have a decent wisdom, so I've got some good common sense, but I think that's actually going to work a little bit better. So that's what we're going to go with for our character. So the next thing that we're going to do is just kind of fill in the information on our sheet here. So for me, I always get asked this, and I've seen it done two different ways. But when you look at the character sheet, you have a large field and a smaller field. What I like to do is put the ability score in the smaller field, because the score itself doesn't come into play a whole lot. The modifier does, though, so I like to have the modifier as the larger number. So if we look in our player's handbook, and we'll zoom back out here. If we look in our player's handbook on page, what do we have here? On page 13, you have your ability score chart and modifiers. So we're just going to go through. So for our 8 intelligence, we're going to have a -1. 10 or 11 are considered average, so they're going to have a 0 modifier. 12 and 13 are going to have +1. 14 through 15, which I don't think we have any of those, would be +2, and our 16s are going to be, +3. So we're just going to fill those numbers in now. So we'll just sort of aim back down, zoom in a little bit more. So I'm going to start off with our strength, which is 16. So I'm going to put the 16 in the smaller field. And hopefully that shows up pretty well. And our modifier is +3. So our dexterity is 13, which is +1. Our constitution is also 16. So again, that's going to be +3. And I don't normally make these this bold, I just want it to kind of stand out on the camera. So intelligence is going to be 8, which is going to give us a -1. So we're not going to be good at history or any knowledge-based skills. Our investigation's also not going to be super great. That was the main reason I wanted to have a 10 in intelligence before, was for the investigation skill. But on further look, being able to intimidate might actually come in a little bit more handy. And then you may have things like persuasion or things along those lines that you don't necessarily want to have a higher chance at failing, in case you're the only one that can kind of convince someone of something. So our wisdom is 12, and that's going to give us a +1, along the same lines as the 13. And then we've got charisma of 10, which is going to give us just a 0, so it's not going to modify things positive or negative. And again, I just kind of want that to show up on the camera. If you're wondering why I put the line through it, it's just an old mathematics thing that I learned in high school to differentiate between like an O and a 0. Kind of the same reason that I write an X with sort of like this, with the little thing on the top there, just because I wanted to differentiate it from multiplication signs. That's off topic though. So anyway, so we have that information for our character. The next thing I want to do is go through and write down all of our racial traits that we get as a half-orc, because those are things that you're going to start off with anyway, and I kind of want those to be at the top of our features and traits section of our character sheet. So we'll just zoom back out, and we will have a look at the races. So let's go right to our half-orc. So the ability score information, you don't need to necessarily put that on there, but there's a few things that I'm going to want to put up there. So for example, we'll do our speed, which is 30, and the speed section is just right here on the character sheet. So we'll put that in right away, because I don't think the barbarians do get faster as they gain levels, but I don't think that actually changes at first level. So we'll just, like I said, try to make that stand out a little bit there. So they get that. They also get dark vision out to 60 feet. They get menacing, which gives them proficiency in the intimidate skill. They get savage attacks and relentless endurance. So relentless endurance is when you would drop to 0 hit points, you're not killed, but you are reduced to 1 hit point instead, and you have to get a long rest before you use it again. And then savage attacks, when you score a critical hit with a melee weapon, you can roll one of the weapon's damage dice one additional time and add it to the extra damage of the critical hit. So the way that that works is when you get a critical, which is on a roll of a natural 20, you roll double the dice damage that your weapon deals. So if you're using a longsword, for example, which we're not, but if I made this one instead, with the greatsword, I should say, I think I said longsword. But if you're using a greatsword, you roll 2d6. If you get a critical, you roll 4d6. With the the savage attacks, you would roll 1 additional weapon dice, which would be an extra d6, so you'd be rolling 5d6 total. Now, if you're using a great axe, which we're going to be using with this character, with Krusk, you would roll a d12 normally, plus a d12 for the critical, and because we're only rolling 1 weapon dice, the Relentless Attacks lets us roll a whole other d12. So if you want to do the maximum amount of damage possible, or you want to maximize the odds of doing decent damage, a great axe is better for a half-orc barbarian than a greatsword. So there you have that. So the first thing we're going to do is just write down dark vision out to 60 feet. We're going to write down relentless endurance. Now, at this point, you can either, if you have your own player's handbook, you could just write the page reference down. So that's on page 41, again, for the half-orc abilities, or you can write sort of a short form of what it does, which is what I like to do. So I'm just going to put once per long rest. If reduced to 0 HP, get reduced to 1 HP instead. So it's just sort of like a short form of how that works. And again, my handwriting is pretty bad, but there you go there. And then we also have savage attacks. So I'm actually going to put a little bit of a space between them. I meant to do that with the other one, but I didn't. So savage attacks. And that's just roll 1 extra weapon die on crit. Okay. So as far as everything else goes, our menacing gives us the proficiency in the intimidation skill. So what we're going to do is we've got our skills down here. These circles, if you're proficient in the skill, you shade that in. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to shade in intimidation. And that's it for our race. Now at this point, the next thing I like to do is look at the backgrounds and choose the background before I start filling in all of the character class information. The main reason for that is, excuse me, the background is meant to represent what you did before you began adventuring, and it also gives you proficiency in 1 or 2 different skills automatically. So some of these might be also on your class list. So I like to do this first, just so that way you avoid that duplication. Or if you decide that, like, hey, I like this skill, I'm going to use it for my class, and then you choose a background that already has it, then you have to go back and choose a different skill. So we're going to go through the different options here. Now I'm going to choose the Outlander background. So that's the one that I'm going to choose. But this is kind of an interesting way of trying to come up with unique and new ideas for your character. So with the Barbarian, there's actually some really interesting things that you could do. Like, for example, as a Barbarian, I could take the Acolyte background and be sort of like the shaman of my tribe, for example. I could be like the mystic or whatever, the storyteller, or the person who leads the spiritual prayers, or things like that. Don't necessarily have any like clerical abilities, but it's kind of, an interesting concept. Now, you would want to sub out some of the things, like a prayer book, for example, might be replaced by, something that you would have that's sacred, like maybe a totem that you would pray to, or things along those lines, or just some stories of like your gods and why you venerate them. But it's something that'd be kind of cool to do. Another background that might make an interesting choice would be like even an entertainer. You might be like a fire eater, for example, or a storyteller. Now, amongst barbarian tribes, storytelling is a huge thing, so having that might be kind of cool. as well as, you know, you could be a folk hero. Not so much with the guild arts, and I don't think that works too well. Hermit, of course, works perfectly fine if you're, you know, a barbarian that lives alone. And noble is another one that I kind of like. I thought was kind of cool because you could be, you know, like the chieftain's son, for example. And you would change some of the things around. So, for example, when you have position of privilege, instead of being able to meet with nobles of like the civilized lands, whenever you meet another barbarian tribe, you might be able to, you know, gain an audience with them, which is kind of cool. But I'm going to use, I'm going to use the Outlander background, and that gives us athletics and survival as our automatic proficiencies, as well as a musical instrument. I'm probably going to choose drums for that one, or the horn. I think I might choose horn, and it just gives you the following equipment, as well as an extra language, which is kind of cool. So you get like a staff, hunting trap, trophy from an animal you killed, traveler's clothes, and 10 gold pieces. I'm going to choose probably hunter-gatherer as my background feature. And you've got like wanderer there, so you can always remember the layout of a terrain that you visited. And we're going to go through and do the personality traits. Just going to kind of show these off really quickly here. I'm not going to read all of them out, but I'm going to choose probably option number 1 here. So I'm driven by a wanderlust that led me away from my home. So that'll probably be the personality trait. For the ideal, would probably be number 3. So if I dishonor myself, I dishonor my whole clan. Our bond is, since I have wanderlust, I'm probably going to go with I suffer awful visions of a coming disaster and will do anything to prevent it. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I left. That's probably one of the better ones, since, you know, my homeland's not going to be destroyed for this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to choose number 1. My family, clan, or tribe is the most important thing in my life, even when they are far from me. And then my flaw is, I've got to be honest, I'm doing number 1. I am too enamored with ale, wine, and other intoxicants. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill that information onto the sheet, and I will be right back. Alright, so I am back, and what I have here is I've just filled out all those details for the information. So for my background, I put Outlander, and I put Tribal Nomad up top. I also have the equipment that I have filled out here, my gold pieces, my languages now on page 41 for the Half-orc. Under languages you get common and your racial language automatically, so I had common and orc. My background gave me 1 additional language, so I took giant. I thought that made the most sense. And then I have musical instrument horn. And oh, I forgot to put in the ability to recall the terrain, which I think was wanderer. Was that wanderer? Yeah. So for wanderer, so I'm just gonna write in the word wanderer, and just because I don't want to write all of that out, I'm just gonna put page 136 PHB, so I know where to look if I need to refer to that skill, or that ability, that trait. So the next thing we're going to do is go to our class, and then we're going to fill in our final details. So the first thing that we're going to do here, we're going to look at our hit points. So at first level you get 12 plus your constitution modifier. We have a constitution modifier of +3, so our hit points are going to be 15, and I don't want to keep zooming in and out in this situation, so I just wrote my hit points up top here, 15. We also have proficiencies, light, medium armor, and shields, simple weapons, martial weapons. I'm not going to worry too much about that. Our saving throws that we're proficient in, our strength, and constitution. So we've got our saving throws on this particular sheet is underneath our proficiency bonus, which we'll get in a moment. So we've got strength and constitution, so I'm going to shade in the circles there, similar to how I did with the skills. And then speaking of skills, we get to choose 2 from animal handling, athletics, intimidation, nature, perception, and survival. So here's the thing, our race and our background have already given us intimidation, survival, and athletics. So I don't need to choose any of those. That would basically be a waste because you don't add double your proficiency bonus. You just, it's just something that you don't want to do. So I can choose between animal handling, nature, and perception. I get 2 of those. So the question is, which one of those do I not want? I definitely want perception for sure. So that's an easy choice that we're going to make there. And so it's either animal handling or nature. So animal handling is wisdom, and nature is intelligence. Now I already have survival, which can double for a lot of things that the nature skills can sort of do as far as what I would want. So I'm actually going to take animal handling, I think, as my skill. So for a proficiency bonus, we just look on our chart here. Now it's actually the same for each and every single class. But they have it on every class chart, so our proficiency bonus is going to be +2. Our special abilities are going to be Rage and Unarmored Defense. We get 2 rages per day, and when we are in a rage state, we do an extra 2 damage with our attacks. And I believe that's specified with melee attacks. I'll have to look at that. Yeah, it says melee weapon using strength. So you have to be using your strength there. So that's kind of what Rage does. So you have advantage on strength checks and strength saving throws. When you make a melee weapon attack using strength, you gain a bonus to the damage roll, which is shown there, so we get +2. And we get our resistance. In Unarmored Defense is just we get to add our Constitution modifier as well as our Dexterity modifier. So I'm going to write those abilities in, and we're not going to be using any armor. So let's do that right now, actually, before I kind of cut away. So first thing, proficiency bonus is going to be +2. So just to fill, I'm going to do it with the saving throws because that's going to be a little bit easier. So for our saving throws, we're just going to anything that's shaded in, we get to add our ability score modifier to the we're going to add a proficiency modifier to our ability score modifier. So for a strength saving throw, we've got a ability score modifier +3, proficiency bonus +2, so we're going to be doing +5. Dexterity, we're not proficient in, but we have a +1 modifier, so we get +1 to dexterity checks. Constitution, whoops, I shaded in the wrong one. We're definitely not proficient with intelligence. Constitution is the same as strength, so +3 modifier, +2 for +5. The 2 coming from our proficiency. Intelligence is going to be -1, so that one's going to not be so great if we have to do those. Wisdom is going to be +1 for what we have there, and we're not going to get any bonus to our charisma. So that's what those look like. So our armor class, we always start with a base of 10, and because we're not wearing armor, we get to add our Constitution modifier to our Dexterity modifier. So our armor class is going to be 14 without wearing any armor whatsoever. And I'm just going to write down on Armored Defense and Rage down here for our class features. So yeah, the next thing I want to do is just choose our starting equipment, and then I'll just fill in numbers which will finish off our character. So whoops. So for Barbarian, so here's our starting equipment. And again, I'm using this would be Adventurers League legal. So we get to choose between the options here. So I can choose a great axe or any martial melee weapon. I'm going to go with great axe. I can do 2 hand axes or any simple melee weapons. Or any simple weapons, sorry. I'm actually going to do the 2 hand axes. And the last thing we get is an explorer's pack and 4 javelins. So I'm just going to write down great axe, 2 hand axes. And you can throw the hand axes. And we get 4 javelins, and we're going to get a explorer's pack. And the explorer's pack contains a whole bunch of stuff in it. It's just basically a standard equipment pack to avoid having to go through the process of buying the items individually. So I'm just going to skip right ahead to the equipment section and just kind of show you the packs themselves are described on page 151. So our Explorer's Pack gives us a backpack. Whoop, a little bit of glare there. So it gives us a backpack, a bedroll, a mess kit, tinderbox, 10 torches, 10 days of rations, water skin, and 50 feet of hemp rope. So I'm not going to write all that down, but I will do PHB 151, so I know exactly where all of that is. As far as our other things go here, we've got our, zoom back out, we'll go to our weapons chart, which we have right here. So we have Great Axe, as you can see there. It is 30 gold. It's the one in between the glaive and the longsword. It's in the white column. Does 1d12 slashing damage, and it's just a two-handed weapon. And our hand axes, I believe, are up here. So I'll have to tilt the camera up. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit further for the hand axe. So we got hand axe there. They do 1d6 slashing, and they're thrown, so that you can throw them at a range of 20 feet for short range or up to 60 feet for maximum range. Anything beyond 20 feet, you're at disadvantage, so you'd roll 2d20 and take the lowest if you go to throw it. Thrown weapons use your strength score so for attack rolls and damage. So I'm just going to fill in those numbers as well as the skills, and we're going to be done. So I'm going to do that off camera, and I will be right back. Alright, so I've got everything filled in here, so we'll just zoom in a bit on the sheet. So I just got all my skills filled in the same way I did for the saving throws. There were a couple things that I forgot to mention. First of all, the javelin. The javelin is a thrown weapon, however, it's not also doubling as a melee weapon. So when I said that thrown weapons use your strength, that's for thrown weapons that can also be used in melee, which is the hand axe in this case. But the javelin uses my dexterity modifier for attack rolls and damage rolls. Now for the attack rolls, because I'm proficient in all of these weapons, I add my proficiency bonus, which is up here, +2 to the relevant ability score modifier. So for the Great Axe and Hand Axe, it's +3 for strength, and the Javelin's only going to be +1 for the dexterity. So I'm just going to fill that in right quick. So for Hand Axe, I'm attacking at +5. For the, the Great Axe, the Hand Axe is also going to be a +5, and then the Javelin is going to be +3. I also wrote down their damages already, so I add strength to the damage for the Great Axe and the Hand Axes. I also wrote down just an initial for the type of damage they do, so slashing, and piercing in this case. And I just wrote down how many I have of the Javelins and Hand Axes, and their ranges of 30 foot / 120 for short and maximum range, and 20 and 60 for the hand axe. I also just wrote down that rage gives me resist to piercing, bludgeoning, and slashing damage, and +2 to melee damage. And I can also rage, twice per day. Alright, so the final details that I need to fill in. So I've got my hit dice. So hit dice you can spend in between after a short rest to heal up without having a cleric in the party. So it's just kind of getting almost like a second wind kind of thing. Your hit dice is equal to whatever you roll for your character class. So the Barbarians are d12s, and you get 1 per level. You regain any spent ones at a rate of like half your level per long rest to a minimum of 1. So I got 1 on first level, so I have 1, and they are d12s. So I just wrote that down there. My initiative modifier is equal to my dexterity modifier, which is +1. And the last thing I need to fill out is my passive perception. So your passive perception is your perception modifier for the skill, +10, which is considered to be like the average result if you rolled a d20. So 10 plus my perception modifier gives me a passive perception of 13. And there you have it. We are done. We have our first level Barbarian all filled out. So I hope you found this video helpful. This was a bit longer than probably the other ones are going to be, because I'm not going to necessarily be going through explaining all the steps again in subsequent videos. So I'm hoping that this will be a series that people will watch all the way through. I'll just make some subtle references in future ones, just in case it's someone's first video, and I'll reference them back to this one as far as the full steps go. But I hope you enjoyed this video. So we have Krusk made and ready to go. So thank you guys very much for watching. Like I said, I hope this was helpful for anyone who's looking to first make their first character or an early character for them. And if this is the kind of character class that you want to play, if it suits your style of melee combat, just getting in there and dealing lots of damage while also being able to soak up a lot of damage, this is going to be the class for you. Again, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. Take care.